What's up, everyone? Today I'm continuing my series on solving Kennedy, and I'm here in Miami, Florida, at the former site of JM Wave, once one of the largest CIA stations outside of Langley. In the 1950s and 60s, this unassuming complex was the nerve center for covert operations aimed at overthrowing Fidel Castro, and it was where one man in particular rose through the ranks, David Atlee Phillips. Phillips was no ordinary agent. He was a propaganda mastermind, a psychological warfare expert, and according to both contract killer James Files and Cuban exile leader Antonio Viciana, he was their handler. Today, this site is just a military history museum, closed to the public when I visited, but for those who know what to look for, the secrets still echo from the walls. While I was in town, I also visited the University of Miami. Why? Because supposedly, they hold one of the last known copies of Phillips' 1988 memoir, The Secret War's Diary, a self-published book that's been virtually erased from the internet. No listings on Amazon, and none on eBay. Nothing. At first, I was excited. The catalog said it was available, so I headed up to the 6th floor stacks, only to find nothing but The Night Watch, Phillips' earlier and more sanitized autobiography. But The Secret War Diary? Gone. Vanished. The staff told me it had mysteriously gone missing in 2016. Did a spy remove it? A rogue researcher? Who knows? But let's just say I wasn't thrilled after driving hours for what could have been the missing piece of this puzzle. Still, the Kennedy section in the library was impressive. Books I'd only seen online were now in my hands, including works by key figures I mentioned in my first Solving Kennedy film. And The Night Watch? Turns out it had been heavily annotated by a past researcher. Underlines, highlights, and notes. For me, that's gold, because it means I can fast-track the clues. So now, let's dive deep into the shadowy world of David Atlee Phillips, the man who may have written the CIA script for Dallas. This is Solving Kennedy, the Phillips Connection. As you might know from my previous videos, I set out to solve this murder. The one they said was already solved. But buried beneath the bullets, beneath the patsies and the commissions, was a man. An actor, a liar, and a professional ghost. They called him David Atlee Phillips. But to at least one witness, he was Maurice Bishop, and he met with Lee Harvey Oswald 2 months before the assassination. He denied it under oath, but the files tell a different story. And so do the men who knew him, and one of them broke his silence 50 years later. This is not a theory, it's a puzzle, and this is my investigation into the man who may have helped murder a president and rewrote history to cover it up. Before he was a spy master, before he trained exiles, impersonated voices, or sent false cables that reshaped world events, David Atlee Phillips was just a man with a script. He was born on Halloween, 1922, Fort Worth, Texas. His father died young, oil stocks gone, country club revoked. He studied Spanish, chased dreams of the stage, and sold cemetery plots to get by. He also attended Texas Christian University. Phillips was an actor prior to World War II, and during his youth, used to star in plays. During the war, he served as a nose gunner in the United States Army Air Force. He was shot down over Austria and captured by the Germans, but somehow was able to escape and make it back to Allied lines. Captured by the Nazis after his plane went down, Phillips was sent to a POW camp in Germany. Most men waited for liberation, but Phillips chose escape and got lucky. Phillips dressed in a makeshift disguise. He walked calmly across the yard, carrying a clipboard and mumbling in broken German. His disguise was crude, his German was worse, but he moved with conviction, like a man on the inside, a lesson he'd never forget. He didn't run, he didn't hide, he just walked, all the way into the woods and out of captivity. And though he was only 23 at the time, his life would never be the same. In David Atlee Phillips' own memoir, The Night Watch from 1977, he wrote about his time as a World War II POW prisoner and described how he escaped from the prison camp. I was captured and held in a POW camp in Germany. I escaped by disguising myself, walking through a guard post, and slipping into the forest. His brief but vivid account of walking away in disguise has been widely cited by the CIA historians and interviewers, including the Washington Post obituary and CIA publications about Phillips' career. That escape wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a life built on illusion. A man who could easily become anyone and disappear just as easily. After the war, he returned home, failed as an actor in New York, wrote plays no one produced, and sold cemetery plots in Texas. Then, boarded a plane to Santiago, Chile. He gave up the stage, but not the performance. In Chile, he bought a printing press, launched a newspaper, and waited for someone to notice him. And then, the CIA found their perfect messenger, the right voice in the right place, with the right instincts. They offered him $50 a month and a news script. In a New York safe house, Phillips sat in a brownstone apartment. His handler gave him a folder. A chalkboard behind them read, Tradecraft, Covert Persuasion. He was trained in psychological operations, propaganda, blackmail, and betrayal. In just 2 years, he'd be orchestrating a coup in Guatemala, not with guns, but with lies. The CIA saw potential in him. Fluent Spanish, theater background, owned a newspaper, the perfect cover. He was trained to create illusions, to manipulate crowds, to fabricate revolutions. The CIA called it psychological warfare. David called it the big lie. The next time he'd go undercover, it wouldn't be in a prison camp. It'd be in a country, a movement, a name. Guatemala, 1954. The CIA wanted a revolution, but they didn't have the troops. What they had was David Atlee Phillips. His job? To convince a country that it was already falling, to fake an army, to invent battles, to collapse a government with a signal. The president was told the country was lost. He resigned, without a single real shot fired. David Atlee Phillips called it a success. The agency called it genius. But it wasn't war. It was theater, and it worked. The big lie became a blueprint. If you can control the story, you can control the outcome. Phillips was promoted, given more resources, more influence. He made friends, powerful ones. E. Howard Hunt, David Morals, Theodore Shackley, a fraternity of covert killers, men who'd later circle back around another name, Kennedy. But this was just the opening act. The next stage would be Cuba, Castro, Miami, then Mexico City, and somewhere in that long shadow, Lee Harvey Oswald and James Files. The revolution came fast. On January 1st, 1959, Fidel Castro rolled into Havana. Batista fled. The world called it liberation. The CIA called it a problem. But one man stayed behind, deep cover, an American posing as public relations consultant, a tourist, a ghost. David Morals, Havana Station Chief. Phillips worked directly under David Morals, the CIA's chief of operations in Havana. Their job, monitor the new regime and plant the seeds for its destruction. In a leaked CIA internal memo, priority asset deployed to Havana under commercial cover was called Operation Psychological Penetration under the code name Bishop. And that's the name that would follow David Atlee Phillips for the rest of his life. Not Phillips, but Maurice Bishop. One of his first recruits was a banking executive named Antonio Vecinia. He didn't know Phillips' real name, he only knew the voice, the orders, and the mission, kill Castro. He knew him as Maurice Bishop.
Sí, en la investigación que hizo el House sobre la muerte de Kennedy, ellos me llevaron a Filadelfia y alguien que decía que era muy bueno haciendo, yo le fui describiendo y él sacó el sketch.
Vecinia would later build Alpha 66, the most aggressive anti-Castro group in the hemisphere, funded by the CIA and trained by Maurice Bishop. But this wasn't just about Cuba anymore. The U.S. had created a monster, and Phillips held a leash. Phillips had perfected the art of disappearing, and Bishop, the name, gave him cover to do whatever the hell he wanted. No badge, no fingerprints, just whispers. What began in Havana didn't end there. Bishop/Phillips would show up again in Miami, in Mexico, and eventually in the company of Lee Harvey Oswald.
David Phillips, who was with the CIA in Mexico City then and is now retired from the agency.
Why did you watch Americans going in and out of the Soviet and Cuban missions?
We didn't watch Americans going in and out. We watched these missions on our radar screen, and every once in a while there would be a blip, and the blip would turn out to be an American.
You know he was at the Cuban embassy?
I do.
No doubt in your mind about that?
There's no question in my mind.
You believe he was at the Soviet embassy?
I'm not sure about that. I'm positive that he made contact with them. They all thought he was so strange that they didn't want to have anything to do with him, and they rebuffed him and told him that they were not interested.
How certain are you of this?
I'm positive. I know there are a lot of stories about photographs of Lee Harvey Oswald taken in Mexico. None were taken. There were no photographs of Lee Harvey Oswald.
What about the accusation that is made flatly sometimes that the pictures of Oswald were destroyed?
Absolutely untrue. I was there, and I know.
In Miami, the sun rose over palm trees and pastel motels, but below the surface, there was a secret war. To most people, Miami in the early 1960s looked like paradise, but underneath the surface, in bungalows, safe houses, and rented office parks, the CIA was preparing for a possible World War III.
Got to the point where it was just kind of a joke about how this secret operation working against Castro was being held down in Miami. And this wasn't a small building. It's hard to see. This is kind of a massive enterprise. These are big buildings, so it took this massive amount of space in Miami. These big buildings, it was considered the University of Miami South Campus. That's actually who they rented the space from, the University of Miami. And then UM basically said, you just keep it. Just keep it. You basically transformed it now completely into a government-run facility. It's all yours.
They called it JM Wave. It was the largest CIA station in the world outside of Langley. And the man in charge of psychological warfare was David Atlee Phillips himself. His team included ex-FBI men, propaganda experts, and Cuban exiles. Their mission, destabilize Fidel. Their tools, black radio, fake newspapers, psychological ops, and a growing militia of angry, armed patriots. Phillips was everywhere and nowhere, behind every broadcast, every article, every whisper that Cuba was about to fall. Cuban exile leaders announced attacks inside Cuba. Journalists took notes, cameras flashed, and in the back of the room, a man with sunglasses and a notebook, Phillips, watched quietly. He organized exile raids, coached spokesmen, and invented victories that never happened. Guerrilla units were created on paper. Explosions were staged for the press. This was a war by perception. And even that wasn't enough. Castro wasn't falling. Kennedy was losing patience. And Phillips, he was just getting started. In 1963, Phillips was transferred again, this time to a new stage, Mexico City, 2 embassies, 1 defector, and a name that wouldn't go away. The final act had begun.
I had been stationed in Cuba in 1959, 58. I was there 59 and 60 before I had to leave rather abruptly. I had an affinity for Cuba. The Cuban people are marvelous.
On every occasion, his interest was Fidel. When is Fidel leaving? Where is Fidel going? What are Fidel's itineraries? Clearly, they intended to assassinate him.
These operations against Cuba were known to the Attorney General of the United States, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, the Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, the President of the United States himself.
In Mexico City in September 1963, the CIA had the Cuban and Soviet embassies wired like fortresses. Hidden cameras, microphones in the walls, every phone call recorded, every visitor photographed. And then a name showed up, Lee Harvey Oswald, an ex-Marine, defector, returned from the USSR, now trying to get into Cuba through the embassy in Mexico, a walking red flag. The CIA claimed Oswald called and visited both the Soviet and Cuban embassies, agitated and aggressive, but when the tapes were played back, something was wrong. It wasn't Oswald, not even close. The photos didn't match, and the voice didn't match. It wasn't him. This became known as the Oswald Imposter Incident, and the man responsible for the entire surveillance program in Mexico City was David Atlee Phillips. He said he couldn't recall seeing Oswald's face in the photos. We were simply relaying information as we received it. He denied seeing the photos, denied managing the case, denied any link, but other agents said otherwise. So why would they fake Oswald? Because if they could place him in contact with Soviet or Cuban officials, the assassination could be blamed on Castro or the Kremlin.
There is now new evidence that someone in the CIA did try to implicate Cuba in the assassination, and on top of that, confuse the investigation into the activities of the real Lee Harvey Oswald. Antonio Veciana was once a CIA operative. He says that within days of the assassination, his CIA case officer asked him to persuade his cousin Reese in Cuba's embassy in Mexico to say Oswald had been there.
He questioned me, do you think if we can offer a good money, a great deal of money to Reese, he can accept that he was with Lee Harvey Oswald in Mexico?
So you think that the American case officer, the American intelligence officer, was trying to make up a story?
Yes.
Why did you never give this information to the Warren Commission?
I never received a subpoena or I never received a call. And in my profession, you know, this is a risk to talk. And now it's 15 years. But in that time, it's better to be quiet and to be silent.
Sometimes we ask ourselves if someone did not wish to involve Cuba in this. Because I'm under the impression that Kennedy's assassination was organized by reactionaries in the United States, and that it was all the result of a conspiracy. This is my opinion. And my impression is that the man who carried it out was a provocateur.
In 1963, Antonio Veciana ran Alpha 66, the CIA's fiercest anti-Castro paramilitary group, but he didn't take orders from Langley. He took them from a man who didn't officially exist. Veciana only knew him as Maurice Bishop, his CIA handler. He never knew his real name until later. What Veciana saw changed everything. 2 months before the assassination, he walked into a Dallas office building and saw Bishop speaking with someone he'd never forgot, a man he'd only recognize later from the newspapers.
Since it involved the Cuban connection, I want you to tell me to the best of your recollection. I'm taping this now. What the contents of that transcript of that conversation were.
To the best of my recollection, there was something indicating in the translation this guy speaking terrible Russian.
All right.
My name is Lee Henry Oswald.
All right.
Have you had any word about me, about my visa? I'm not positive. Something along this line.
All right.
Some sort of indication that he expected, hoped to travel to Cuba with the idea of going on to the Soviet Union.
All right.
That is my best recollection.
Anything else?
At one point or another, there was something that left me with the impression that he said something like, "You should talk to me," or something like that. I do not recall that he said anything about paying for my trip. I cannot tie that recollection specifically to this transcript. It could have been, or it could have been something else.
All right. Yes, Tom.
Mr. Phillips, from the inflection in his voice in the transcript.
on the conversation when he said, "You should talk to me." Today, what would you say that inferred? Well, of course, I was seeing only the written thing. If this had been under different circumstances, I would have drawn the inference that he was up to some sort of espionage, something very serious, from a man who just telephones to Soviet embassy. I would gather he was someone who was naive and didn't know that someone was probably listening to him. And I never heard the tape, so I don't know what the reflection was.
And on November 22nd, 2013, 50 years to the day after the assassination, Antonio Vicinia wrote a letter to Gaetan Fonzi's widow, Marie. Maurice Bishop, my CIA contact agent, was David Atlee Phillips. Phillips, or Bishop, was the man I saw with Lee Harvey Oswald in Dallas in September 1963. There it was, in black and white, the final piece. One man, 3 identities, one connection that ties the CIA directly to the accused assassin. Bishop was Phillips, and Bishop met with Oswald, and Phillips lied under oath, and the CIA knew. They called him a conspiracy theorist, but Fonzi was right. David Atlee Phillips was the master of everything. In 1978, David Atlee Phillips finally sat down before Congress. A House committee tasked with reinvestigating the murder of the president was ready to ask him about 2 names, Maurice Bishop and Antonio Vicinia. But he denied everything, calmly, directly, under oath. And just like that, the door slammed shut.
The CIA never had an official meeting where they said, hey, here's where we're going to plan on the murder of the president.
Pero un grupo de personas que pertenecían a la CIA, encabezado por David Phillips, decidieron matar al presidente porque lo consideraban traidor y que estaba poniendo en peligro la seguridad nacional.
But he happens to know that a group of officials working within the CIA got together with the clear plan to assassinate and murder the president because he thought he was a traitor to the national interest of the United States.
Desde entonces, algunos mandos militares aceptaron la muerte de Kennedy.
Once that decision was made, and from that point forward, there were segments within the military leadership of this country that also accepted and understood the plot to kill the
Y fue
president.
una conspiración donde intervinieron algunos mafiosos.
And it was a conspiracy plot that also integrated the use of certain elements of the mafia.
Privately, when shown the composite sketch of Bishop, Phillips laughed, said it looked like one of his brothers, a family resemblance, a deflection. And one of David's brothers was a prolific writer. James Atlee Phillips, former pilot, suspiciously well-informed novelist, published under the pen name Philip Atlee, wrote books featuring a recurring hero, Joe Gal, a freelance U.S. government agent who solved international conspiracies and covered up dirty CIA operations, spy fiction, or a backdoor confession.
And who was this man, James Anthony Phillips, you were mentioning to me?
James Atlee, A-T-L-E-E.
Atlee Phillips. Well, you said that he was one of the most remarkable mystery writers in America, and I'm ashamed to say I know nothing
Well,
about
I think
him.
he's a damn good writer by any standard.
Yeah. What's he written? This book, Pagoda, you mentioned.
Pagoda, suitable for framing, The Deadly Mermaid, and he wrote one called The Shivering Chorus Girls, which I never could get hold of.
Yeah. It's the trouble. I believe there's some very good thrillers, you know, that publishers let get out of print and vanish off the scene. I'm sure in publishers' lists there are a lot of very good thrillers tucked away that have been forgotten and ought to be brought out and brushed down again. There aren't enough good thrillers for me. I mean, I like reading them in airplanes and trains, of kinds of books to pass the time with.
After retiring from the agency, Phillips became its defender-in-chief. He founded the Association of Former Intelligence Officers to shape public opinion, crush whistleblowers, and kill conspiracy stories. He spent his final years doing damage control, spinning his legacy, controlling the narrative one last time. But the name Maurice Bishop never left his trail.
The director of the CIA in 1963 was John McCone. he caused a sensation among committee staffers when he admitted there was an agent using the cover name Bishop. But a secret memo reveals he was allowed to reverse his testimony. A CIA lawyer wrote the committee. I should inform you that he had been in error. In summary, Mr. McCone withdraws his statements on this point. The man who fingered Maurice Bishop, Antonio Viciana, was shot in the head soon after testifying, but survived. Frightened, he will no longer talk about the case. We caught up with him in Florida.
They wounded me in the head. They're trying to kill me.
You know why? Why would anybody?
I don't know, perhaps the FBI knows. The FBI knows.
Did they tell you?
No. Actually,
David Atlee Phillips died of cancer in 1988. Investigators believe Phillips was angry at JFK for botching the Cuban Bay of Pigs operation.
But if Viciana was telling the truth, and the files say he was, then Phillips just committed perjury, and the CIA knew it. They had him, cold, but no charges were filed, no subpoenas extended. The committee walked away, and Phillips walked free for the rest of his life.
I made another phone call. I called David Atlee Phillips. I had a number to call. The call was put through to David Phillips, and he was notified where I was at, because I had not told him in advance that I was going to Dallas, Texas, because he always had to know where I was at because he was my controller. CIA purposes, special operations, or something that might be needed done. We always stayed in contact. We had numbers to call. He said, thank you, and let it go at that. We didn't have any great discussion on the phone. I told him where I was at, the location, and through David Atlee Phillips is the only way that Lee Harvey Oswald could have known where I was at. I was staying at the Lamplighter Inn right there in Mesquite, Texas.
And then the next thing you knew, Lee Harvey Oswald.
The following morning, Lee Harvey Oswald was there.
The master of disinformation had done it again. He lied under oath and got away with it, just like he had in Cuba, Guatemala, Mexico, and maybe Dealey Plaza. And by the time the House reopened the case in the late 1970s, many of the people who might have cracked it wide open were already gone. Call it coincidence, call it something much darker, but one name kept surviving: David Atlee Phillips. So after decades of espionage, propaganda, and black operations, David Atlee Phillips reinvented himself once more. As a writer, the former spy master became a chronicler. Some of his well-known books include The Night Watch, a field memoir, The Carlos Contract, a novel of international terrorism, and a book that's very rare today, The Secret Wars Diary. His final work, Secret Wars Diary, was published shortly before his death in 1988. Almost no one read it or knew about it. It vanished from shelves. Was it a confession, a coded memoir, or just another diversion from the man who made a career out of rewriting the truth?
I wonder if he's come across the James File confession and David Atlee Phillips.
Yeah.
Has he noticed those two names?
Yeah. The caller referenced James Files is a man who was in prison. I think he got out recently in the last couple of years, who claimed that he was the assassin, that he was the one who shot the president. You know, Files doesn't have any independent corroboration of his story, and so it's a little hard to know what to make of it. He could have, based on what he said, I think he could have learned all of the things that he said from just reading the literature of the assassination. So I don't know, I don't disbelieve it, I don't believe it. I just think we don't know enough to whether we should credit that story. You referenced David Atlee Phillips. Phillips was mentioned by James Files. He was a senior operations officer in the CIA. He's one of the senior officers who I mentioned before, who knew all about Oswald before the assassination. There's a big file on David Atlee Phillips that remains with many, many redactions, and we did not see any of that last week. So he's a person of interest. David Phillips is a person of interest to JFK researchers. He knew a lot about Oswald before the assassination. When he was called before investigations, he told a whole bunch of stories about Oswald, some of them quite contradictory. He couldn't keep his Oswald stories straight. So another reason why people are skeptical about the CIA's role in that. I mean, if it's so simple that Oswald up and shot the president, why would you tell so many different stories about him? You know, that's a good question about David Phillips. There's a lot of information that has not been made public about him.
James Files pointed the gun, Fonzie followed the evidence, Vicinia connected the names, and I followed them into that same damn maze. One by one, they all led me here, to a man who staged coups, lied to Congress, invented wars, and may have orchestrated the perfect political murder in American history.
So many people that are great people that work at the CIA, but back then there was an issue, and I think really it's the deep state controlling the CIA. I mean, we know of cases, you probably know too, and if you watch the Sean Ryan show and watch the episodes with Sarah Adams, I mean, things that, you know, decisions that total things like the whole Benghazi thing about the protests that started, the Hillary Clinton lies about all that kind of stuff. We all know that those are made up intelligence report where the CIA lied to the president and to the public. That's what we need to stop. I mean, you know, and it's not just for the greater good or whatever kind of BS, reason you come up with it. But, you know, James was involved in a black op. He thought he was doing his job, you know what I mean? And Gordon Ferry, our good friend, said Jimmy, his only problem was he didn't know how to say no. And I know when he was doing ops, if they came to him and said, "Hey, here's your mission," yes, sir. And he would go, and somebody was going to die. You know what I mean? Or whatever the mission was. And JFK was no different from that. And I've talked to him. He'll tell you right now that 29.3 yards, 88 feet. I've stood there behind that fence with Jimmy, and now the fence has been moved and it's about 100 feet. But with that Remington XP100 221 Fireball over that fence, about 8 feet from the corner, I've stood there with Jimmy back in 2023, and it would be an easy shot. And I know the CIA is petrified. I don't know why 62 years later, there's nobody in the halls of Langley that's got anything to worry about being prosecuted or anything like that. Okay, yeah, they did some kind of crazy thing 60 years ago, but it was really a rogue operation. I mean, all the people with the CIA didn't take a vote and say, "Yeah, let's kill Kennedy." You know, it was kind of a rogue thing that Dulles was behind. The deep state was pushing it, and I mean, we know that even like going into Iraq and the justification to go into the war in Afghanistan, total BS. I mean, they just made it's like the false flag. It's like the Maddox incident, the Vietnam War, another CIA false flag to just get us into a war.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. Upon receiving the first preliminary hard information of this nature, last Tuesday morning at 9 a.m., I directed that our surveillance be stepped up. And having now confirmed and completed our evaluation of the evidence and our decision on a course of action, this government feels obliged to report this new crisis to you in fullest detail. The characteristic of these new missile sites indicate two distinct types of installations. Several of them include medium-range ballistic missiles capable of carrying a nuclear warhead for a distance of more than 1,000 nautical miles. Each of these missiles, in short, is capable of striking Washington, D.C., the Panama Canal, Cape Canaveral, Mexico City, or any other city in the southeastern part of the United States, in Central America, or in the Caribbean area. Additional sites not yet completed appear to be designed for intermediate range ballistic missiles capable of traveling more than twice as far and thus capable of striking most of the major cities in the Western Hemisphere, ranging as far north as Hudson's Bay, Canada, and as far south as Lima, Peru. In addition, jet bombers capable of carrying nuclear weapons are now being uncrated and assembled in Cuba, while the necessary air bases are being prepared. This urgent transformation of Cuba into an important strategic base by the presence of these large, long-range, and clearly offensive weapons of sudden mass destruction constitutes an explicit threat to the peace and security of all the Americas.
David Atlee Phillips wasn't just a witness to history, he was its editor. He was Maurice Bishop. He handled Lee Harvey Oswald and James Files. He lied to Congress, and the U.S. government let him. For 65 years, David Atlee Phillips played roles: soldier, reporter, actor, and spy. But if you line them up, the story becomes clear. He walked through the gates of a Nazi prison camp and never stopped walking. He became head of psychological warfare. His script, chaos. He overthrew a government with a microphone. He invented a name, then buried his own inside it. He built a secret army in Florida and fed America a war that never happened. And the moment the mask slipped, he protected the lie. His final act, spin the truth so hard, no one could entangle it. No trial, no charges, no reckoning.
If the CIA had the power to run this country, would it really have let itself fall into this low disrepute that it's in now?
What happened?
Well, what happened in the 25 years since someone talked? I'm convinced that a great many decent Americans, men and women, 1/3 of the people who work at CIA are women, were in a profession which has been practiced as long as it's the second oldest profession. And they have believed that they were doing a job that was necessary. And they did it because their government asked them to do those things. There are a lot of them now that believe the things that they did were wrong, but it doesn't do any good to come with tears in your eyes. But what happened was that they got into trouble because American presidents and American secretaries of state adopted policies that called for covert action and secret operations.
He didn't pull the trigger, but he pulled the strings. And the CIA wanted a fall guy. They had Oswald. They needed a ghost. They had Bishop. If there was one man who could tie the plot together, it was David Atlee Phillips.
Fidel Castro says that his government had nothing to do with the assassination of President Kennedy and that he does not know this man, Lee Oswald, who is the suspect. What do you personally and what does the Cuban colony here in Miami think about Cuba's involvement in this?
Well, my opinion is I think he have to be something with what happened with Mr. Kennedy.
You think that Castro has something to do with the assassination?
That's what I think.
And what have you heard about this among other Cubans here in Miami? What are they saying?
Well, I don't speak too much about that because everybody must know about that because Castro have to see something with that.
And the question which the jurors passed on, as I said earlier, every single juror, every one of them, who heard the testimony of the White Citizens Council, the black members of the Congress of Racial Equality, the others involved in a really unlikely conspiratorial group, who all testified about the close continuing relationship between Clay Shore and Lee Harvey Oswald, despite the CIA's efforts to disparage Jim Garrison and to discredit him. That body of evidence is a very important body of evidence and remains there totally unrefuted by the CIA or by Mr. Shaw. Add to that the CIA's admission now...
Mr. Shaw, I thought Mr. Shaw was dead.
Yes, he is dead now. That's correct. I'm not sure that was relevant to my point, but anyway. Add to that the admissions by the Central Intelligence Agency of their close continuing relationship with Clay Shaw going back to 8 years before this period when he was involved with Lee Harvey Oswald. That being given, we have the documents, we have the testimony. How can you sit here, since you don't know anything about that, and say categorically, as you did, Oswald had no relationship with the CIA? How can you do that?
What I'm saying is based on, or I make a hypothesis based on the facts available to me, and I say that I'm convinced that he was not. Obviously, there could be some super operation and they're not going to come tell Dave Phillips about it. I say I am convinced on the evidence available to me. And I do not buy the idea that because there was a connection between Clay Shaw and the CIA, if there was one, and Lee Harvey Oswald, that necessarily proves that the CIA used Clay Shaw to do this. I really had thought that all the Clay Shaw business had been considered by nearly all serious critics as just something that we didn't consider anymore.
And then there's David Perry, there's George Morenship. We haven't gone to those other CIA conduits to Lee Harvey Oswald. But just this one, if you're not familiar with that body of evidence, then I don't think you should be traveling around the country saying the CIA had no contact at all to anyone with Lee Harvey Oswald.
Will you answer the second question concerning the disclaimer?
The disclaimer. No, I am not going to say that I'll do that because I think I'll consult two brothers who are lawyers first. One reason being that I have 5 kids to send through college and I couldn't afford the cost of winning a suit.
I can't afford the cost of being liable anymore.
Are we going to finish? Or?
Make one final sentence and then we will.
Okay. I feel I have to explain 2 things about using the New York Times and the Washington Post as sources today. The reason that happened was this. I came here and I had a certain idea from the correspondent sent to me about what kind of meeting this was going to be. I walked in this morning and watched, and boy, it got to be pretty hot this morning. And then I saw my former colleague Ray Klein leave, and as I started to go up the stairs, there was almost a fight going on. And I thought, this really is different than I thought it was. And when I first started lecturing a short time ago, my lecture agent said, never speak more than 55 minutes and don't ever have a drink before you speak. Well, I decided I better do 2 things. Go back to my room and have a good drink and get some newspaper clippings, because I made up my mind that I would not attack you personally.
Where did you find them in your hotel room?
No, I brought them with me.
Oh.
I brought them with me. I really don't understand that you see there's something wrong in knowing that you're going to go across the country to debate a ban and not bring a newspaper clipping that you have about it. Finally, I want to say one thing. I have not said that there was not a conspiracy to kill Jack Kennedy. The statement was made earlier by Mark himself, quoting my book. I've been talking about those things I know about and what I'm convinced. I don't know what happened to Gamma. What I'm trying to say today is let's find out. The investigation has now been going on for almost a year, and in the meantime, let's don't do it with gamesmanship.
One of the people I interviewed was the nephew of David Atlee Phillips, named Sean. And according to Sean Phillips, just before his death, David Atlee Phillips told his brother, who was Sean's father, that he was in Dealey Plaza on November 22nd. Now, we've placed David Atlee Phillips in the training camps, the anti-Castro training camps. We placed him with Oswald, and now we see that somehow he is there in Dealey Plaza on November 22nd, looking over what there is to see. I doubt he was certainly not a shooter, but he was there.
It's amazing. I mean, that's amazing. And you had some information that I had not seen before that said that Lee Harvey Oswald was debriefed at Atsugi. Is that how you pronounce that? I'm not sure. After the defection?
I found new information about Oswald being debriefed even in New York. Information that is not in A Farewell to Justice, but that I managed to get my hands on. So people always said, well, how come Oswald wasn't debriefed? Yes, he was. And there was, of course, also CIA people at Atsugi who testified that Oswald was involved with the CIA and involved in the, in the Kennedy assassination. And that's James Wilcon. And that, again, then, of course, the government has to discredit the witness. And one of the people who discredited that witness was named Harold Leap, who worked for the House Select Committee on Assassinations. And Robert Burris, who was the police investigator for the state of Louisiana, said he spotted him instantly as a CIA operative who had infiltrated the House Select Committee on Assassinations.
Now, I have not changed my story in the 5 years I've been telling it this way. When we were 15 years old, my companion Vicki and I spoke with Lee Oswald and the CIA's David Phillips, with Antonio Veciano present, in the lobby of the Southland Center in downtown Dallas on the morning of September 7th, 1963. Okay? Now, I'm here to tell a story with some information. I'm not here to give you, to preach an angry sermon and talk to you about good guys and bad guys, okay? This is just information. It derives from my memory. I'm afraid I cannot give good documentation. I state flatly that I'm not lying and I'm not deluded, okay? All right. Excuse me? Rather Vicky spoke. Neither I nor Veciana said anything when the five of us were together. I simply listened. All right, in 1979, the House Select Committee on Assassinations learned of the lobby meeting from Veciana, almost accidentally, by the way. It showed a connection between Oswald and the CIA, and they were not sure about that at the time. In 1979, Veciana was not yet identifying Maurice Bishop, Phillips' pseudonym, as Phillips, but it was clear that, quote, Bishop, unquote, was highly placed in the federal government, probably with the CIA, which is, of course, a deep. You know who David Phillips is.
The CIA never charged him. Instead, they welcomed him. The FBI never exposed him. And the Warren Commission never even mentioned his name and never even bothered to call. But we just solved the puzzle. David Atlee Phillips helped to orchestrate the assassination of John F. Kennedy. He didn't pull the trigger, he pulled the strings. And history let him vanish. I think we just solved the Phillips connection to Kennedy.